UFC Fight Night Dariush versus Sarukian takes place this Saturday, December 2nd from the Moody Center in Austin, Texas. This is Casual Roundhouse Fight Talk. We're going to preview this card. Starting with the first fight on the card, Jamie Lynn Horth versus Veronica Hardy. Hardy has more experience overall in the UFC, but Lynn Horth is undefeated and riding the momentum of a successful UFC debut. And for that, I believe Jamie Lynn Horth is the favorable pick, more likely than not by decision. Wellington Turman versus Jared Gooden. Both guys are coming off decision losses, but Turman does train with Glover Teixeira and Alex Pereira, who is currently the light heavyweight champion, which is good company and could give Turman some momentum going into this one. But if you're a sports bettor and you see that Jared Gooden plus 160 underdog bet with both guys coming off of losses, bet it's your own risk, but that's an underdog bet, maybe worth taking. Nonetheless, I'd favor Turman in this matchup considering the circumstances as well as the team that he has around him. Rodolfo Bellato versus Ihor Potieria. Potieria has more UFC experience, more high-level experience, despite mixed results, but Bellato only has 2 career losses, and both are to Vitor Petrino, who is coming off of another knockout recently against Modestas Bukauskas at UFC Sao Paulo. Despite those 2 losses, Bellato has been seemingly unstoppable, and I think Bellato is the favorable pick in this matchup, considering Potieria was also beaten by Carlos Ulberg at UFC Charlotte earlier this year. Melquizael Costa versus Steve Garcia. This has fight of the night potential. Melquizael Costa is coming off of a ferocious striking display decision win in his last fight against Austin Lingo, where he was just picking away at Lingo from a distance, dashing in with hands, and dictating wherever the fight went with his kicks. Steve Garcia, on the other hand, he's on a 2-fight finishing streak, looking to be on a warpath, essentially, since losing his last fight in the summer of 2022. And again, he's a betting underdog despite being on a 2-fight finish streak, which I think is a bit of an eye catcher. If you're a sports bettor and you like those risky underdog bets, I think Steve Garcia as a plus 195 underdog on a 2-fight finish streak is a bet worth taking. Nonetheless, it's going to be on Costa to neutralize the dangers Garcia brings. If the fight does stay standing and if he does get in trouble, it's going to be on Costa again to take the fight to the ground and mix it up. Keep an eye out on this matchup. Joe Solecki versus Drakkar Klose. Solecki finished Charlie Deaton in his last fight, but he also has a win against Jim Miller from a few years back. And Drakkar Klose, despite coming off of victories, has looked relatively sloppy in his stand-up in those victories. And I just feel as though that's something Solecki could capitalize on. That does not mean that Drakkar Klose is still not super dangerous, because he is. But despite Solecki being the betting underdog, I would have to favor him in this matchup. Zachary Reese versus Cody Brundage. So Brundage is coming off of the DQ win against Jacob Malkoun, where he was being controlled in the grappling before an illegal strike landed to the back of his head. And Zachary Reese, on the other hand, is making his UFC debut. He earned his contract on Dana White's Contender Series this past season with an impressive finish. And it feels as though Brundage's back is against the wall. And stylistically with this fight, considering what we saw of Zachary Reese in the Contender Series, I would have to favor him in this matchup. The featured prelim, Miesha Tate versus Julia Avila. Miesha Tate's coming off back-to-back losses and tough fights, and she's having to work her way back up the rankings against a fresh face in Julia Avila. This is a toss-up of a matchup. Miesha's chance to reinsert herself into the rankings and display that she is still a problem, and the same can be said for Avila. Not sure who to take on this fight. I think it's a toss-up matchup, but we'll just keep it at that. Originally, Khalil Roundtree was supposed to fight Azamat Murzakanov on this card. Murzakanov had to withdraw and has since been replaced with Anthony Smith. That fight will be taking place at a later date. Nonetheless, the main card opener is Punahele Soriano versus Dustin Stoltzfus. Soriano and Stoltzfus are both looking to bounce back from tough finishes. Soriano is a more dangerous striker, which I believe will favor him in this matchup. And Stoltzfus is really going to have to show something of himself, considering the Abus Magomedov fight was his last outing, and it did not last long enough to really get any legitimate tells for Stoltzfus, compared to Soriano, who in his last fight against Kopylov was in a dogfight and hung tough until he couldn't anymore. So I would favor Punahele Soriano in this matchup. Play Guida versus Joaquim Silva. Play Guida is always hanging tough, no matter who's in front of him, despite always seemingly losing the decision. And Joaquim Silva's coming off of a fight against Arman Tsarukyan, where he hurt Tsarukyan early in that fight, clipped him with a left hook. And despite being finished later in the fight, I think that's something that will enable him to have confidence going into this fight against Guida. And I think that Joaquim Silva is definitely the favorable pick for this matchup. Like I said, Guida hangs tough no matter who he's in there against. And I feel as though it will be similar in that aspect, but I will favor Joaquim Silva. Sean Brady versus Kelvin Gastelum. Gastelum's return to welterweight has officially arrived, and it comes against a top 10 opponent in Sean Brady, who is looking to bounce back after that loss to Bilal Muhammad last year. And he's in for a tough fight because Gastelum has momentum following that incredible fight against Chris Curtis earlier this year, where he looked refreshed. And I think a lot of people underrate Kelvin's grappling as well. And the odds makers probably did that when making these odds, considering he is a plus 100 underdog. Those are tight betting odds, which is understandable because they're giving Kelvin respect. But again, if you're a sports bettor, you like taking those risky underdog bets, why not go with Kelvin Gastelum following an impressive victory and moving down a weight class, seemingly refreshed? Rob Font versus Davison Figueiredo. Rob Font's coming off of a tough loss to Corey Sandhagen, where he took that fight on short notice, and despite Sandhagen injuring himself early in that fight, he controlled Font for a duration of the 5 rounds in the grappling and won the decision. It was a tough loss for Font, considering he took that fight on short notice and couldn't really take much away from it, but he's taking on Figueiredo, who's moving up from flyweight, former flyweight champion. And I think that Rob Font is going to be massive in there against Figueiredo. Understandably so, Figgy cuts a ton of weight to get down to flyweight, which is something he won't have to do in this fight. But I think Rob Font's going into this matchup with something to prove, similar to how he went in against Adrian Yanez earlier this year. And that can only benefit him because Rob Font with a chip on his shoulder is a very dangerous fighter. Not to mention, I'm Puerto Rican. Rob Font's one of the few Puerto Rican fighters who is still ranked and competing at a world-class stage. So, I'm going to have to root for Rob Font in this one. The co-main event, originally supposed to be Bobby Green versus Dan Hooker, replaced with the man who caused the injury that Dan Hooker had to withdraw from this fight because of. Jalen Turner fought Dan Hooker to a 3-round decision where he lost, but broke Dan Hooker's arm in the process. And considering this is part of the reason that he is being granted this opportunity against Bobby Green. But there's a lot of points to be made about Jalen Turner's weight, considering the fact that he did miss weight against Dan Hooker, and he had a full training camp for that one, and he's going into this bout against Bobby Green on short notice, and he's already made it public that he has a lot of weight to cut, so one can only think that this might affect him if he does get down to 155. Nonetheless, Bobby Green's coming off that knockout win in the first round against Grant Dawson, where he essentially reinvigorated himself at lightweight, because Grant Dawson was one of those guys nobody wanted to fight because they didn't want to lose their ranking to him, and Bobby Green gladly snatched all that hype from him. This should be an interesting fight. I think Jalen Turner's easiest path to victory would be mixing the striking into the grappling, getting Bobby Green into positions that he's not comfortable in, and eventually finding a submission. Bobby Green as a betting underdog is not a bad bet to take if you're a risky sports bettor, but I think the favorable pick, despite all the circumstances, is still Jalen Turner when you talk about the stylistic matchup. And the main event, Beneil Dariush looking to bounce back after a loss to Charles Oliveira in what was seemingly a number one contenders fight earlier this year, against Arman Tsarukyan, who has already been in there against the current lightweight champion in Islam Makhachev and gave him a ton of different problems. It was a competitive 3-round decision loss for Tsarukyan against Makhachev, but it showed that he is more than ready and belongs within the rankings at lightweight. I feel as though Tsarukyan's coming into this fight with a chip on his shoulder, especially considering the fact that he did get hurt in his last fight against Joaquim Silva, who is not ranked. And this potentially could be Dariush's final fight in title contention if he is not able to defeat Tsarukyan. And that's unfortunate considering how underrated Beneil was for such a long time. But with that being said, Tsarukyan is younger, he's more explosive, he's got a lot more technique, he's got a lot more different ways to mix the fight up. And with that, I think Arman Tsarukyan is the favorable pick in this matchup. Be sure to let me know what you guys think of these matchups and what your picks might be in the comments. If you enjoyed, leave a like. If you want more content, subscribe, because it's just going to keep coming. And I appreciate everybody that's tuning into these. This has been Casual Roundhouse Fight Talk, and we'll see you in the next one.